What is going on, everyone? Today, Sony has announced the new ZV-E1 full-frame video recording camera for primarily content creators. And I have been lucky enough to be trusted with, a pre-release model. So that's actually what I'm talking to right now. I'm super thankful for Sony for trusting me to have this pre-release. And I've had this for a few days. I've played around with it in the studio, but unfortunately, I just haven't been able to go out into the field. Kids got sick, life got in the way. And I actually have to send the camera back today. And I had a photo shoot lined up today that I was going to use it on, but unfortunately they canceled last minute. And so I'm sitting in front of my nephew's house and talked them into letting me come do some portraits of them. They're big into baseball, so we're going to do some baseball style portraits, and I'm going to use, this new camera to basically create content. So I'm going to record some behind the scenes, maybe some talking head stuff. I don't have a microphone in it or anything like that. And so I'm using the microphone that's built into this camera. But yeah, come along with me and hopefully we can create some good stuff. All right, so we are back in the studio. Hopefully you enjoyed the quick little clips from that shoot. Unfortunately, my plan didn't actually come to fruition. So I had planned on doing this outdoors. I planned on having a lot more time. What ended up happening is that it was super, super windy. I went out, I was like going to try and set up anyways. The wind blew over my light stand, blew over my backdrop. So we got like quarantined off into the garage. And I ended up only having about an hour to set up, take the portraits. I tried to take a couple video clips and then load everything up. And then I had to take them to their grandma's house. So I didn't get a ton of time to shoot like I initially planned. But hopefully you got a good idea of kind of what this camera can do a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the other specs that I think are really interesting and going to be very useful for people like myself. Now, when I talk about people like me, I'm talking about content creators. So I'm not a movie maker. I'm not creating films or anything like that. And so I want high quality video and high quality features, but I don't necessarily need cameras like the FX30 or even the FX3 or the Sony A7sIII. And so what this camera is basically all of those high-end features kind of put into a body that is smaller, easier to manage, and the functionality is there, but at a easier entry so that people like me that maybe don't understand all of these features can use them in a simpler form. So the sensor that is in this camera is basically the same sensor that is in the FX30 or the A7S III. So it has 15 plus stops dynamic range. It can go up to ISO 409,600. It has the same AI-AF that comes from the Sony A7R Mark V. So it has that built-in AI chip. It can do human tracking, bird tracking, animals, cars, planes, trains, like the whole 9 yards. But where this camera really shines for me is the ease of use. And so as like a single person shooter, one of the coolest things that I didn't actually get to fully test out, so I don't have any like video clips to show this, but it has what's called dynamic active mode. And within that, it has AI-based framing. So what that means is that whenever it uses this active dynamic mode, which basically is kind of like a ramped up version of image stabilization so that you can get like gimbal type fluid video motion without a gimbal. Because whenever you're using that feature, it kind of crops in on the frame. And so when using that, when it's cropped in on the frame and using the AI autofocus, what happens is as I move around the frame will actually move and track with me. And so what this means is that you could essentially set up in a scene to where you're actually like walking around and the frame will track you, similar to if you had someone like tracking you on a tripod or tracking you with a gimbal. And so you can get some movement into your frame without actually having a second shooter or having a gimbal with any sort of like tracking features or anything like that. It's all just internal to the camera, using that AI autofocus to track a subject, and then also using, the punched in version of this dynamic tracking to kind of track you around the frame, which I think is super helpful and kind of very innovative for content creators that are using a single body and not traveling around with like a team and stuff like that. So speaking of the dynamic active mode, what this does is it gives you a little bit more punched in of a frame. So you get a little bit more crop. You're still shooting at 4K. But what it does is it gives you 30% more effective tracking and stabilization than active mode. And so in this clip right here, which I'm going to show you real quick, I'm just kind of like running with the camera handheld. I don't have any sort of gimbal or anything like that. And I'm running and moving the camera up and down and trying to get some like an interesting motion as my nephews are hitting this baseball out in the field. And I think it did a really good job as far as giving me that like gimbal qualities. And again, so I'm not a filmmaker, so this is something that is beyond me. I've played around with gimbals and stuff like that. And so being able to do this with just the camera and no prior knowledge of how to actually do this really well is really impressive. And it's actually very helpful for content creators. So another thing that I really like is that this is, I believe, the first Sony camera. And I don't know too many other cameras. I know there's a handful. But this new camera can actually have LUTs loaded onto it. And so if you're using some of the high dynamic range options, which are inherently kind of hard to, expose and actually see an end result, with this camera, you can actually load LUTs onto it. So you can use those LUTs to kind of actually get a better idea of what your exposure is like. You can actually use those as an exported file. And so you can save some time on editing. And I think it's just going to make using this camera in some of those more high dynamic range settings a lot easier to use. So another thing worth mentioning is that this camera has a bunch of shortcuts, switches, buttons, custom functions that you can set up to make filming very easy. So you can set up shortcuts for certain types of filming. So you just have to turn it on, hit a button, move a switch. So it makes it really easy for kind of run and gun filming, especially if you find yourself in various situations over and over again. You can basically set up things within this camera to make it really easy to kind of dive back and forth for filming functions like that. It also has things like 4K 120, which isn't going to be in the camera upon release, but it's supposed to be in a firmware, I think in June is kind of the roadmap that they have for that. Another thing that I think is really important to point out is the audio feature of this camera. And so most internal microphones on cameras are not very great. This one is better than most, and I think in the audio in the opening clip, I felt like sounded pretty decent. I'm just sitting in my truck. There's cars driving by. There's someone mowing their lawn. It's not the most ideal audio recording situation. I am inside my truck, so it's a little bit better than it could have been. But the microphone that's built in on this camera has the ability to record, or has like a smart feature where it can decipher if it wants the audio from in front of the camera or behind the camera, or you can actually go into the camera and decide and like tell it if you want what's in front or what's behind. Now for the audio on the front, the audio is pretty good, but what I ended up doing is I went into a new Adobe AI podcast audio feature that they have, where you can upload an audio file and it will make it sound better. And so real quick, I'll show you a couple clips showing what the audio is like without that added and what it's like with it added, just so you have an idea. And I think this is something really interesting and useful for content creators that maybe don't have the ability or knowledge, or just don't want to mess with all of these high-end microphones and recorders and things like that. And so you can get away with using lower quality microphones, and now using these tools, you can get much better audio out of your files. What is going on, everyone? Today, Sony has announced the new ZV-E1 full-frame video recording camera for primarily content creators. And I have been lucky enough to be trusted with, a pre-release model. So that's actually what I'm talking to right now. I'm super thankful for Sony for trusting me to have this pre-release. And I've had this for a few days. I've played around with it in the studio, but unfortunately so I think that's a really brief and quick overview of what this camera is. Again, I wish I would have had more time to play around and really test out some of these features. But for people like me, content creators that don't want a really high-end video camera in order to create that content, I think this is actually a really perfect body for that. It's one of the smallest, lightest full-frame interchangeable lens cameras there is on the market. I think it's the smallest and lightest with in-body image stabilization. And so it's something really easy to kind of pack along with the rest of your gear that you're using to create images or videos or whatever it is that you're creating content around. I have some other ideas that I want to use with this camera, so I'm hoping to get my hands on one to play around with it a little bit more. But hopefully you enjoyed this, and if you did, I'd love a like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And yeah, let me know in the comments what you guys think of the camera, and I'll catch you on the next one.